I'm curious to know what you told your students to look for when they went out to shoot at the, did you tell them or did you just say, look, this is how you use the equipment, just go see what's there? What did you do?
Yeah, so we prepared in a couple of ways. We started the first day of the class with a video that we watched together called 4 More Years, which is a documentary about the 1972 Republican National Convention, also made by a collective, a crew of many people. And it's significant because it's the first time that any such event, any event really, had been covered with a portable video. Video is so much less expensive than film that meant that for the first time people could just shoot everything without worrying about cost, and could also essentially start paying attention to the things that, if you are thinking of thousands of dollars per minute, you can't pay attention to. And so we watched that and we thought about the ways that they're paying attention to the people who aren't delegates, who aren't politicians, and getting all kinds of opinions and how much it still speaks to us today, 50 years later. And we also, then we listened to podcasts by a journalist named Scott Carrier, who definitely doesn't hide his own political leanings, but he also truly listens and asks really good questions to whomever he's talking to, whatever their political leanings. And so we took those two, I guess, prototypes, those two sets of media as models for how we could approach the Republican National Convention in a way that would be different than, and was different than, all the mass media that descended upon Cleveland. And I guess to finish that question, so I was definitely designing or curating those examples into the course, but then it was the students and I together, and mostly, I would say mostly the students, who I tried to give more agency to them in crafting the baseline questions that we would all be starting with, and then that we could ask follow-up questions to whomever we were talking to.
I want to say that those clown people were so prepared, and I'm wondering how many meetings. I'm just picturing all the meetings they had. They had a couple of different chants. They had a song written. I mean, they were really, I kind of enjoyed that. But I will say, sometimes documentary filmmakers struggle with something like this where we don't get to really know the characters, and so it can kind of skew into making fun of people or making them look ridiculous. And so I'm just wondering, where is that line for you, and how did you explain that to your students, and are you concerned about that, and all those questions that come up when we take on a project like this?
So this is actually the second version of that film. The first was a feature-length version, and that we actually finished editing that one at the end of the course. It was 55 minutes long, and it included many more characters than we saw in this one. And I'd say, but even that one didn't include many other characters that were filmed. Mm-hmm. And I'd say, I mean that in both senses of the word. Characters in terms of just being in the film, and mm-hmm. then real, well, I mean, we see a lot of real characters who were present there. I'd say we didn't I think, especially in honing down towards this last one, we weren't thinking about what we should or how we should represent particular people. We were just thinking about which scenes we really had to include, and also which scenes together would make the film coherent, not necessarily representative of our time there, but what would really make a film, make a short film, and I think also editorially what we wanted to say with the material that we had.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, the African American man towards the beginning, to me, when he first started talking, I was like, oh no, here we go, And then as he started to talk, and I started to really listen to the content of what he was saying, you let it play out enough that I could kind of get past the yelling and stuff, and he really made me think about things in a new way. I was actually able to kind of understand, maybe not agree, but actually start to understand what he was saying, right? And so that's, for me, it's important to maybe not agree, but to understand. So do you feel like that was part of your goal with this, or was it just?
I'd say that was a lot of what we talked about going in.
Yeah.
was to really be present and really listen and try to understand what every person was saying. I have one student. We worked in teams, and there were 3 teams from the class who were filming, and I was also filming. I was part of one of the teams, and one of the teams, not mine, ended up on both days. They found a person, and they would interview that person for 1 to 2 hours. And I have no idea how they had the stamina to do that or the patience, but they came up with some. I think they're the people who you see interviewing most in this film. One of their interviews that didn't make this version was really interesting in that they were talking to a conservative. He wasn't a delegate, but he was a Republican who was there, and a white man, and my student who was interviewing him is an immigrant from Mexico, who she's not a citizen. She does have a green card, but she's not a citizen, and they were talking for a long time, and he was telling her what he thought of immigrants, and especially immigrants from Mexico, and then she got to share with him her story. And it was really interesting because you saw both her, I think, being changed by listening and really connecting to this person who had very different beliefs, but you also see on camera him changing as he's making this connection with her. So that was really exciting, which I only saw in the material later, but exciting to see. And something that I saw repeatedly at the RNC was that sometimes big name media channels, like ABC or the Huffington Post, would start following my students, or their host or interviewer would kind of step aside, and the camera person would just focus on my students interviewing whoever they were with, because the quality of interview was just very different than they were used to or they were trained to get.
In what way were they different, do you feel?
I think they were there they weren't trying to get a soundbite, for one thing, and they weren't. I think we designed our questions to try to get past as immediately and completely of what people thought they were going to be asked and going to be talked about, of like, why do you support Trump? And I think that question comes up a little bit, but we tried to design our questions to get to the heart of who people were, and how the heart of who they were was bringing them out for this. And just other, that process is slower, and so I think that's not a standard process that big name media tend to use.
I know a thing I love about documentary is things are always different than I imagine they're going to be. Like I have this image of why I go to film something, and then I go film it, and I'm like, oh, wow, okay, that was completely different than what I had imagined. I mean, when you went down there and came back, did you have any thoughts or experiences that surprised you?
I mean, I think everything surprised me. But I don't know if it was one, like a particular thing.
Yeah.
To give an example of something that didn't make it into the long version, but was a surprise and certainly was entertaining. There was this. So you all saw the protester for the greatest injustice in the history of America.
I know. Wow, he really committed to that. Yeah.
And well, there was a similar kind of very kind of farcical protester who he had signs and he had a T-shirt that said "White men with small penises for Trump." And he was a white man.
Okay.
He was a white man.
Yeah.
And my students who interviewed him, asked him questions about his beliefs and why he was supporting Trump. And his spiel, it was very rehearsed. It was very much a performance. And I think the fact that you felt that it was a performance, and with the guy in the film, it's kind of like, it's on the border. You can't really tell if it's ironic or not. I think that's how he remained, and the other guy didn't. But it was hilarious and a really interesting form of protest through support of the candidate. And so I think that was surprising, the ways that humor was channeled so that it wasn't just protests and counter-protests, but there were the actions and speeches and communication was going off in other directions as well. That surprised me. And this was a scary time. Not all the students in my class decided to go to Cleveland because in the 2 weeks before the RNC, there were police shootings of civilians. I think there were a couple shootings, one of which was another shooting of an unarmed black man, and then another police shooting of a civilian. And there was also a civilian shooting of police in Houston. And so a lot of people were really nervous, and Governor Kasich, not Governor Kasich, I forget, the governor of Ohio. I live in Ohio, I should know this, but
I don't know either.
Declined to, was encouraged to and declined to put a temporary ban on firearms in Cleveland during the NRC or the RNC. And so there were a lot of people who were, as their form of protest, open carrying at the convention.
Oh my God.
And so the combination of all of those things made a lot of people nervous. And so some of my students chose not to go. And then being in Cleveland, I think seeing the raw protest and emotion for Tamir Rice was something that I didn't, I don't know, I guess I living in Ohio, I had kind of felt that and been aware of that, but seeing that come out during the RNC was really, and it's still when I see the film, it gets me every time. It
Yeah.
surprised me in a different way.
Well, I need to move on to the second film because we have limited time. So I'm not sure everybody understands the process that you went through to make this. So I would love for you to kind of walk us through how it all kind of came together, because it was going to be, I know you mentioned a little bit, so it was going to be a fiction film, then it kind of turned documentary, and then you added in these elements where there was a dream, and then your characters are watching the film, and so how did that all kind of come together?
So as I mentioned before the films, this started through a collaboration with my co-director, and it was at first just going to be his film, and then certain things from his film worked really well, but other things did not, and so we decided, we knew that the project had to change, so it became a documentary, and we had to look for our story. So from the original project, we had basically two scenes that made it to this final film. One is when Don Juan is doing the cura on the baby. That was one of the very first things that we shot. And the baby is actually my co-director's daughter, who's now 7. And we, I mean, just being in the presence of that scene and Don Juan doing this really special thing was amazing. I think everyone that night felt it was amazing, and we were very pleased to see that the footage also was strong. The other thing that was from the beginning was the little segment of the dream sequence where there is a woman speaking into the camera, and then there's a machete chop, and her necklace falls to the ground.
And there's that huge bug there.
Oh, yeah.
That huge beetle.
A huge beetle. I think there's a snail.
I'm like, oh my God, yeah.
And so that was actually, it's part of a dream, but that part of the dream was not Juan's dream. It was my co-director's father's dream. That he had, and he told my co-director, and that we had then scripted and filmed, and it became eventually part of Juan's dream in this film.
How about what the characters watching the film? How did that all?
So the characters watching the film, I was thinking a lot about how to, I'll come back to that in just a sec, say that at first when we were filming in Chiapas, it was really, everyone knew that everyone involved with the production, including myself, we were all trying to help Saul realize his vision for a short film. And when I came back a year later, it was clear that it wasn't exactly the same. It wasn't just Saul's film, that we were co-directors, that we had a different relationship. I had received in the meantime the Guggenheim Fellowship, and I had the intention of using that fellowship and the money from it to make this film, and in particular to be able to pay the people in it, to pay them as actors, just because, I mean, they deserve it as much as or more than anyone, for their time, in a way, like, as I came to find out the risk that they were taking by being involved with us in our production, since other people in the community didn't see it as a good thing necessarily. And Juan had a similar idea, but from his perspective, like, he knew even before I had a chance to tell him that. He made it clear that he would only participate under the right circumstances. And every time I met with him, when he first saw me, it was very warm, but then there was also this, every time I saw him, he had a different story of his hardships and kind of what he needed help in this way and in that way. And then he also resisted filming. We would set up a date, and a date to film, and we would talk about, we settled on an hourly and a daily wage, and then he would be like, I can't really do it. I have other things, and I could tell he was just trying to push me to see how much he could get out of me, how far I would go, and.
Now, did he just do that with you, or what? I mean, or is it just? Do you know what I mean? Did he do it to your co-director equally, or do you know what I'm saying?
He knew I had the money,
Okay.
not my co-director.
Okay.
And so, so it was to me, but sometimes when I wasn't there, he would, go to my co-director and he would talk to him in different ways. Anyway, so it was really frustrating to try to work with him and him kind of putting a stop on the production. And so we just said, okay, we've already decided, we've agreed to the hourly and daily wage. We just have to show up, camera ready, and film so that the stories that he's telling become part of the film, potentially. And so we did that. We showed up, and that's when we got the scene where he's speaking directly to the camera.
So the first time.
Mm-hmm.
I had a hard time with that myself, and I'm trying to figure out it's a hard scene to watch for, I'm sure, other people. And it's hard for me to watch as a filmmaker because I feel like, it keeps cutting. And so I keep wondering, are you never answering him, or did you cut your own answers out? And so that was my question.
It was, so as I said, we'd already kind of belabored this topic with him of what the deal was and how I would help him, how I would pay him, and how much I would pay him. And so in that sense, I didn't feel like he needed an answer. He knew, in a sense, what we were doing and what the deal was.
So it was a little bit of a showdown.
It was a little bit of a showdown. I also felt then, and when I've shown the film with Juan and he's responded to the audience questions, I definitely still feel really strongly that he was aware that he was speaking not just to me, but to an audience.
Okay.
And filming it, I definitely felt that to be the case. And that was certainly a goal of mine and of ours, was for the audience to feel implicated in the relations, the filmmaking relations, and even the class relations of making documentary.
Yeah, and inherent in that is the obligations that we have as filmmakers with our subjects, and what are they giving us, what are we taking, and vice versa. And so it gets super complicated.
It gets super complicated, and usually, and I really intentionally, the stuff that usually gets swept under the rug or kept under the table, I very intentionally put it on the table. And in doing that, I allowed myself to be a flawed character in a way that is quite rare in documentary. I was already doing that in the film and in the edit when I found a book that gave me words to articulate what I was doing. And that book's called The Journalist and the Murderer. It's by Janet Malcolm, who wrote for The New Yorker.
Okay.
And in it, she writes that the only fiction in a work of journalism is the character of the journalist, who is always represented as this morally upstanding, vehicle for truth to come to the reader. This uncomplicated vehicle. And so I let myself be a complicated person, a flawed person, even if I'm trying to do the right thing.
another thing that made me think was when Carmen, she says, you know, you're taking from our culture and you're making millions of pesos from it. And I kind of thought, I think there's some truth there to what she's saying. And at first it's easy for me as a documentary filmmaker to laugh because there's no money in documentary. You know, it's like, oh my God, are you kidding me? But then I thought about it. I was like, you know, it is an interesting kind of dilemma in that, you know, you're documenting this culture, and that's super important because we're not sure that culture is going to be here in the future. So that's important. But then on the other hand, you are taking this way of living and documenting it and bringing it out to the world, and then, you know, you're making a career out of it. You know, you're teaching and you know what I mean? You're here and, you know what I mean? So yeah. That's hard. That's not even a question, is it? It's just a comment. Okay. I actually have some questions. So, oh no, I had a great one, but I don't know where it is. Oh, so where's the line for you with filmmaking and ethnography? I mean, and I guess that kind of goes with this last thing that I just talked about. So, you know, you're making a film, but do you feel like you're also kind of trying to capture that culture?
Yeah, I'm influenced by traditions of visual ethnography, experimental ethnography, autoethnography, personal ethnography. That was definitely part of my formation as a filmmaker and artist. But I'm not an anthropologist, and I'd say my greatest loyalties are to I'd say like the art of cinema and the art of documentary, and to the people that I work with. And so I don't have. It's much less important for me to follow some standard of ethnography or of documentary than to make a film, I think, that's hopefully speaking of and to, and really thoughtful about the relations with, even if they are portrayed as difficult or problematic, that's really thoughtful about the relations to the people in the film. And all of my films have many less overtly, more subtly, but all of my films have some kind of suggestion about the relationship between myself as filmmaker and the people in the film.
I remember what my question was, which is, for me, what I see in here a lot is the idea of belief. And so, you know, Carmen has her belief with chanting and the digging and the shrine, and he has his beliefs, and he has this belief in this drink that's going to save him, right? I mean, we even have belief in Western medicine that's going to save him. I'm not even sure that, you know, there's, you know, you're showing that screen, and you can see that there's this white part. I'm like, I don't know, I can't really see what he's trying to show me, you know? So I'm just believing that this guy knows what he's talking about just because. So I'm curious, because he says, I believe this is going to fix me. I believe this drink is going to fix me. And you just can't help yourself. You jump in there and you're like, no, I don't think so. I don't think so. And it kind of occurred to me, like, why not just let him have that? Like, you know, you wouldn't break into Carmen and go, you know, that's ridiculous that you're praying to Jesus. There's Jesus, you know, that's not a valid. And so, but you feel this pressure to, like, tell him that drink's not going to work. And can you talk about why you felt like you had to jump in there?
Well, I mean, I had to, because I do believe, I mean, I totally think those guys are charlatans, and that the CEO of this company who's built this pyramid scheme is the biggest charlatan, and he has an empire, and he's a celebrity CEO like Donald Trump, and he's made his fortune off of the poorest and sickest people in Mexico and all throughout Latin America, and even Latin American communities in the United States. And so I thought I couldn't not say that to Don Juan. But you're right. I'd say this question is also interesting because I'd let him make that choice, and I give him the money to be able to make that choice.
But you still wanted to say, like, I don't think this is going to work, but here you could have this.
Yeah, but
Okay.
I you know, and people say that I give him the money to right for the film, which is a little bit true, and that sounds so venal, but it's a little bit true. But also, I give him the money and I let him make that choice because although I never for a second believed that it would cure him, I did believe him when he said, I need this. And I think he really did. He needed something to believe in.
I think so too.
And it was the only thing he could believe in. So there is something that we didn't show in the film on purpose, and that's the doctor's explanation of why he can't have surgery, why he's not an operable case. We chose not to show that because it takes some of the pressure off of me, that tension of like, well, why doesn't the gringo just pay for his surgery and get this over with? I hope, you know, I would think that if I were watching this film. But I'm also hoping that tension also adds to the tension and the way that the audience can feel implicated in watching the film. But really, the doctors who did the ultrasound on him, told us in really clear terms he's not an operable case because he has a heart murmur, he has high blood pressure because of his age and because he's done this hard labor that you see in the film every day of his life, and they don't think that he would physically rest the months necessary to recover from a surgery like that. And so he would just end up worse off after that. So he wraps a band around his belly that has prevented it from getting worse, although he still has pain. One other thing is that the doctor we went to for the film told him that and told us that, and we could kind of keep explaining and translating for him so he would understand, because he speaks Spanish, but he really has a hard time understanding the doctors, for instance. Mm-hmm. But the doctors at the hospitals where he was going, the national hospitals that are free for him once he gets there, never gave him a clear answer like that. He would pay his money for he and his son to travel to the hospital for his visit, wait hours. He would have to take a day off of work, be there all day, and they would say, oh, no, actually, we can't operate. We can't do anything. You need to see a heart specialist first. And then they would make an appointment for him with a heart specialist in another city. So then when he finally had his appointment several weeks later or months later, he would go to the heart specialist, same thing, pay for him a lot of money to get there. And they would say, oh, you know, we can't do anything because you have this other problem. And so he had, as far as I know, it was like 12 different visits without anything concrete, without them ever arranging anything. And so he totally lost faith in the system. And honestly, they gave me a runaround too when I asked if I could film a visit. And they had me write an official letter to the office in Mexico City. I passed it to them. They supposedly passed it on to Mexico City, but they kept saying, oh, yeah. They said, yes, their letter will arrive to us in a couple days. Don't worry. And it never came.
See, I've had that happen in other cultures too, where for whatever reason they won't just say no. I've had it happen in Africa many times where we're not doing it. You know, they won't say it though. It's just like, we'll see, you know, and really they want to say no, but they just won't say no. I finally figured that one out. Yeah. Once you figure that out, things go a little smoother. Yeah. All right, so Q&A. Let's bring some Q&A people up. I have more questions. Oh, good. Okay.
Hi. So I'm going into documentary making, and I just was wondering, since you were dealing with a culture that wasn't your own, where you kind of found that line between exposure and exploitation.
What do you mean by exposure?
Like, just the storytelling aspect of it, and being like respectful of like the story of the characters.
Well, I'm not. Okay. I'll answer it this way. So, for me, it was really important. For me as a filmmaker, it was really important to work with cultures that were more familiar to me before I went to film cultures that were so different from me. And so my first major photography project was actually in Mexico, but I started this project right after, it was about Mexican wrestling, lucha libre, and it was right after I had quit my college wrestling team. And I don't know, so in a way it felt, well, it at once felt at home and it felt far away, and I did that project for a while, and I think the foreignness and the ways that it felt, although was quite happy with the photographs, it definitely felt like I was taking pictures in a way that definitely didn't feel like an exchange. It didn't feel like I had, I wasn't quite sure if I deserved those pictures and the acclaim that I was getting for them. And it took me a while to figure out what to do about that. What I ended up doing that at least made me feel better about it was later I went back and continued photographing Mexican wrestling, lucha libre, but I also started becoming a wrestler in Mexico, learning the art of lucha libre with a mask and identity. And I also started teaching photography and had my students photographed my own wrestling debut. And at times I was able to share my photographs with wrestlers that I had photographed. Creating more of a reciprocal relationship, and also once I started wrestling, I could teach them techniques from American competitive wrestling, which they were really interested in. And as they were teaching me lucha libre, more acrobatic wrestling techniques. And so for me, that was a really interesting place because I could feel exchange in a lot of ways. Later after that, I went home to Nebraska and also home to wrestling in the States. And so I made both photographs and films in those cultures. And two of my first films, I would say, are also ethnographic, but they're about my white, rural, central Nebraskan parents and kind of the cultures that they and I grew up in. And it was important for me to make those films before I made another film in Mexico. And I think that as now I feel more comfortable, I think working in a place like the Zoque region of Chiapas or Oaxaca, where I live now, because I feel like I can establish a kind of reciprocal relationship in one way or another. I always look for that.
Awesome, thank you.
Well, wait, I have a question for you. So did you feel like any point in this film might have tipped over into exploitive at all? Did you have any point where you were like, I'm not so sure about this part?
No, I didn't, but I did see where, like, with different editing, it could have gone that way. I think how the film was composed all together was really beautiful and actually did a lot of justice to that community. But I mean, that's, my opinion. I'm not even a part of it, so I don't know what their personal opinion was. But I think that when you are dealing with like subjects that are of a very different like financial background than you, or where like you see like a culture being appropriated a lot, there is that like fine line. But I think this was a really great story that could be like appreciated by a lot of different audiences.
Yeah, and I think that line is something we're wrestling with more and more as documentary filmmakers is, you know, whose story do we kind of have the right to tell, and are we taking it, or, and so just being more sensitive to it, I feel like we're talking about it more, which is a huge help to me. You know, we're thinking about it and talking about it. So good. Okay. Another question? I can't tell if someone's going to step behind that pillar. I guess not. How are we doing on time? We good? I wanted to also compliment you on the sound work in the film. That I don't know if you guys felt that, but that immersive sound of hearing that jungle all the time, and the cats and the chickens and the, oh my God, it was so great. So how much of that, you know, how did you accomplish that, and, you know, what was the process there?
Well, so the first two periods of filming, I had a sound recordist go with me. I had someone who was a sound recordist.
Because I heard a female voice about the mic, and I was like, oh, who's that? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So she's actually an American filmmaker who went down for one period of filming.
Okay.
So was the sound recordist at that time, and it worked really well because she's Mexican American, and in a lot of, I mean, right, in a lot of ways, the local people could see her and hear her Spanish, her much better accent, you know, perfect accent, and accept her as one, you know, as one of them in a way that I never really will be in the same way.
No.
But she, and actually we all battled with Montezuma's revenge in that period of filming, especially. And so, like, she was out of commission, and so we were like, okay, Saul, it's just you and me, you're the sound recordist. And I had already been teaching him how to record sound, and also how to film. And I've given him cameras and sound recorders, and so he now produces his own videos, his own documentaries as well. But it was a really good that was a great period of transition to working as a two-person crew. Yeah. And from then on, Saul was the recordist, I was the camera person, and we were co-directing, which meant a lot of different things at different times. But one of the places where he as a director could really step in and be crucial was when there was dialogue in Zoque that I didn't understand, and so he could help direct me as a camera person and help me in usually later in the edit or after we had filmed, help me understand what had happened, and then translate the material so I could do the editing.